The next section of this DVD dwells on the idea of good and bad pieces. I would argue that what you absolutely don't want as the endgame approaches are bad pieces in your camp. The enemy's got good pieces, pieces with potential. You just have lousy pieces that can't really do anything. If that is the case, you're well on the way to losing the game. And a very good example of a good piece versus a bad piece was actually seen in the game Anish Giri versus Vasily Ivanchuk. This was a game from Reggio Emilia in 2012. And Ivanchuk really struggles in this game. Okay, well, the opening was a Bogo Indian defence. Very flexible and sound choice by Black. White elects to block with his bishop, and Black now plays the variation with a5. To Ivanchuk's credit, he's willing to experiment with all sorts of different openings. I'm sure his opponents never actually know what he's going to play on any given day. a5, well, it's motivated with the idea that the capture on b4 isn't really very good for White. Black's rook on a8 comes into the game free of charge, and White's knight on b1 is denied the square c3. So Giri decides to play a normal idea in the Bogo Indian. He just fianchettos his king bishop. d5 is most common here. Ivanchuk decides to set up completely differently with e5 in the centre. Black could take on d2 first and then play e5. Ivanchuk decides to play it straight away. And he does this, I think, because he wants to play a curious opening idea of a fellow grandmaster a little way down the line. It's an opening idea, by the way, which I really don't like at all, and you'll see why in a moment. Well, given that Black has not yet moved his bishop on b4, White decides to try and isolate that piece, and is immediately threatening a3, nabbing the bishop. So Ivanchuk's got to give this bishop a bit of space, and he does this by taking on d4. White recaptures. There's pressure against c6. So Black takes, White takes, and now this horrible move, h6, which is apparently an idea of Grandmaster Maxim Turov. Well, I simply don't like it. Just because a Grandmaster's thought it up, it doesn't mean it's any good. Giri, of course, takes on f6, downgrading Black's pawns. The queens come off, and Black is obviously hoping that his bishop pair is going to offset the weaknesses in his pawn structure. But I have to say, I really don't believe it. Giri starts well. He knocks the bishop to a worse square so that he can develop his knight without any fear that Black would play bishop takes c3. In view of White's threat of knight d5, or maybe knight e4, Black decides to play c6, and now comes e3. Another good technical move, denying the bishop on c5 any play. So Giri's idea in this middle game, and even in the coming endgame, is to actually make this bishop on c5 bad, to deny it any prospects. That's the piece White doesn't have in this position. The imbalance in this position is that lousy bishop on c5 versus the potentially strong knight on c3. So on we go. Ivanchuk plays king e7, and then comes knight a4. And the idea of that is to prevent Black from jamming up the queen side after a4. h5. Well, you either like this sort of stuff or you don't. I mean, personally, I prefer bishop e6 here. White is certainly better. But Black is solid. I mean, Black attacks the pawn, White would have to defend it, and the game continues. The problem with h5 is that Giri gets to fix this pawn, and now this pawn becomes a source of difficulty for Black as the middle game progresses into the endgame. Black's got to look after it. He tried rook g8, White went rook f c1, Black went rook a7, and now bishop f3. Immediately giving Black the problem of defending that pawn. Bishop g4 was answered by bishop takes g4, and again the problem for Black is that yes, he can repair one of the defects in his structure by playing h takes g4, but in so doing he's given White a supported outside pass pawn. Please note the hopeless Black bishop, out of play, doing nothing, unable to get into the game. So that's why Ivanchuk takes with the rook, hoping to keep active. King f1 Rook A8. Of course, we're looking for black to introduce this bishop into the game somehow. But to the end, Ivanchuk is unable to do this. Geary brings his knight round. A very good plan. Up she comes to attack the pawn on h5. And black is forced very passive. Knight d3. Bishop comes to b6. Rook b1. White can prepare the pawn lever b4 at his leisure. Knight comes to f4, tying black up, and now b4. The problem for black, he has no counterplay. He's entirely passive, and that's the last thing you want in an endgame. In addition, the bishop versus the knight. Let's compare these two pieces. White's knight towers over the bishop. The bishop cannot get into the game, and that feature of the position will be enough to seal Ivanchuk's fate. Black takes, white recaptures. He wants to play b5 in short order. Rook a4 was answered by rook b to b2, and the idea of that is to exchange off black's active rook by playing rook a2. The problem for black, he's got this horrible passive rook on h8. That's another bad piece to add to the list. He can't move this rook, or the h-pawn drops. So rook a5 was answered by king g2. Again, there's absolutely no rush. Geary improves the position of his king. And black just passes, as he must. Rook a2 finally. Rook takes rook, rook takes rook. And what we have now is a situation where black has three bad pieces against three good pieces from white. Compare the activity of the rooks. White's is much better. Compare the activity of the kings. Well, white's upcoming plan, if black does nothing, is just to bring the king to f5, as indicated. And compare the knight against the bishop. Bishop blocked in, nothing to do. White's knight tying down the rook. All these three things combined mean that black's position is almost certainly lost. He tries d5. At least this way the bishop will play for half a move. White takes on c6 and then takes on d5. That was the drawback in what black has done. He's lost a pawn. And now rook a6. It doesn't matter now that black can surrender the bishop for the knight. What we've actually got into is a lost endgame for black. And Geary emphasises this with the excellent move, rook c6. The game even goes down to a pawn endgame, but g4 seals Ivanchuk's fate, creating an outside pass pawn. Black lurches forward with c4. Geary has it all under control with e4, enabling his king to come back, should that be necessary. Black played king d6, white played f3, black played king e6, and white played king e3. Note that white is avoiding g takes h5 in this position, because then maybe the black king could scramble round and defend. So king e3 was answered by king e5, and g takes h5 now has to be answered by f5. h6, f4 check, king d2, king f6, and now h5 was the last move of the game. Black could do nothing to stop the h-pawns in the long run. Meanwhile, white just comes up and gobbles the pawn on c4. So a horrible passive experience from Ivanchuk. An opening experiment that led to his defeat. He inherited a terrible pawn structure and a prospectless bishop on c5. And those were the causes of his eventual demise.